Hi there. Glucose is very important in the human body. Actually, it's the main source of energy for our bodies. However, having too much glucose or too little glucose isn't good for our bodies. So there is need for something to control the glucose levels in our bodies. This is Z Online School. In this video, you and I are going to be looking at the complete guide to the pancreas. We are going to do this in a systematic way. And if you'd like to know what is the pancreas, the names and function of the hormones produced by the pancreas, or to know what diabetes mellitus is, you are going to understand these totally in this video. At the end of this video, we've got bonus tips for you. Make sure you watch this video till the end to get the maximum value out of it. Let's begin with talking about the pancreas, what it is and the other things that you need to know about the pancreas. From the definition of the pancreas, you will see that we are just stating where the pancreas is found and what kind of substances it secretes. The highlighting of the pancreas secreting enzymes and hormones is very important because this links it to the pancreas being both endocrine and exocrine. Obviously, we know for something to be endocrine, it needs to secrete things directly into blood. And for it to be considered exocrine, it needs to secrete a certain substance into a duct, and then after that, that substance affects something external. We're going to get to know about more of exocrine glands when we talk about digestion, where the pancreas also falls. Meaning, the pancreas is part of two systems, the endocrine system and also the digestive system. It's very important to know more even about the location of the pancreas. We know it's located in the abdomen, but now where exactly in the abdomen? We have some organs here, part of the digestive system obviously. One key thing you should always remember is that the pancreas is found in the abdomen behind the stomach. With that said and done, it's now an important thing that we look at the structure of the pancreas. The structure of the pancreas is not so much complex. Obviously, if you get into the details, yes, it becomes complex, but for us, as we're talking about the endocrine system, it won't be much of things that we'll be remembering. We just need to remember that the pancreas here has got three major parts. This part here, which is rounded at the base of it, is what we call the head. And this big part here is known as the body, while the end here is known as the tail. In the body, we find many structures. Obviously, we have this here, the pancreatic duct, and many other structures. But when we're referring to the endocrine system, we're not talking about the pancreas being part of the endocrine system. We focus on specific portions of the pancreas, which are called the islets of Langerhans. Their name comes from the person who really found these structures. Langerhans was the person's surname. It's even further important to know the inside of these islets of Langerhans as we're talking about the endocrine system. And so we are going to talk about the structure of these. As you can see, the islets of Langerhans are just clusters of cells, as you can see. We have these cells and some blood vessels that are passing through them, alpha cells and beta cells. The alpha cells secrete a hormone known as glucagon, while the beta cells secrete a hormone called insulin. These two hormones are very important, and just to remember them and their respective cells, it's very important for you to identify that glucagon and alpha both have A. And so that's a very helpful way that you can use to remember that the alpha cells secrete glucagon and the beta cells, being the remaining cells, secrete the remaining hormone, which will be insulin. Now let's talk about the functions of the pancreatic hormones. What you should understand is that these hormones will have target organs, and the target organ is just simply the organ which a hormone is destined to cause some change in. There are mainly three: adipose tissue, the liver, and muscle cells. One of the hormones we're going to be talking about in this video, obviously we've got two hormones, insulin and glucagon. One of these two affects all these three, and one of them affects only two. We're going to start with looking at the function of insulin, which is secreted from the beta cells. Insulin is the hormone that is able to target all the three organs we've just mentioned. In the liver, insulin will cause certain changes for the glucose levels in blood to be affected. However, before we go any further, it's important that you remember what we covered in the video about the introduction to the endocrine system. The pattern in which these hormones are going to be working is the hormone getting secreted, diffusing into the blood circulatory system, a receptor on the target organ receiving that hormone. Then after that, that hormone will cause the target organ to change in function. Insulin is the hormone that is going to affect glucose levels when they are high. And we also know that insulin is produced by the beta cells of the pancreas. So what just remains is knowing what insulin does to the liver when it is secreted. When insulin is secreted and reaches the liver via the blood circulatory system, it's going to cause glucose to start getting converted into a storage form which is known as glycogen. So basically, in the liver, we are having insulin making the liver to convert glucose into glycogen. You should be able to remember that this high blood glucose level after the effect of insulin will be normalized, meaning insulin will begin to decrease the blood glucose levels. The next organ the insulin targets is the adipose tissue. Again, we know that insulin is only produced when we have high blood glucose. We also know that it's coming from the beta cells that are found in the islets of Langerhans. Now we're only remaining with knowing the effect of insulin when it reaches the adipose tissue. One thing that will help you to remember the function of insulin when it reaches the adipose tissue is the fact that adipose tissue is the tissue where fat is stored. Therefore, when we have insulin going towards the adipose tissue and reaching the receptors of the adipose tissue, we're going to have fat storage. One thing that remains is knowing how this fat storage comes about. It's important to note that when insulin reaches the receptors of the adipose tissue, it's going to make the glucose that enters the adipose tissue to get split. After that splitting of the glucose, we're going to have those parts in which it's split made into fatty acids and glycerol. Now, we know that fats are made up of fatty acids, particularly 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol. So if in the adipose tissue we have fatty acids and glycerol, the probability that these will combine and make fats is very high. And if you think about it, just like I said, the adipose tissue is there to store fat, and therefore it's easy to remember that insulin on the adipose tissue is going to make the glucose converted into fats. Now, what you see is that if the glucose is being converted into fat, it's like we're subtracting from the glucose that's in the blood, and therefore there will be a decreased blood glucose level. When insulin reaches the muscle cells, we know that the muscle cells here have got a lot of mitochondria, right? So we should be able to relate that when insulin reaches the muscle cells, it's going to create something related to the use of glucose. Okay, we already know that the insulin is secreted when we have high blood glucose levels, and we know that the beta cells of the pancreas are going to secrete this insulin. Here, just like I've said, because we have a lot of mitochondria in the muscle cells, this is what enables the muscle cells to actually reduce the amount of glucose levels. So what happens actually is that insulin that reaches the muscle cells is going to cause a bit of the conversion of glucose into glycogen and increase glucose uptake. It's easy to map the glucose uptake to the fact that the muscle cells have a lot of mitochondria, and mitochondria need energy that is in form of glucose. And immediately we get to remove glucose out of the blood by this increased glucose uptake, we expect that the glucose in the blood is going to decrease. These are the three ways in which insulin is going to affect our body for it to reduce the blood glucose levels. Glucagon, as we may know, can be remembered to be secreted by the alpha cells because of the A's that we can see here. We've got an A in glucagon and an A in alpha. Actually, we've got two A's. Glucagon is the hormone that is only going to target two of those organs. The first organ that is going to target is the liver. And now, what you should notice is that if insulin is being secreted when there's high glucose, this other one is going to be secreted when there's low glucose. Remember that our body does not need too much or too little amount of glucose. So we've looked at that hormone that deals with too much glucose. Now we're looking at the hormone that deals with too little glucose. When we have low blood glucose levels, our pancreas via the alpha cells is going to secrete this hormone we're calling glucagon. Of course, it's secreted into the blood, and when this hormone is in the blood, it's going to pass through the liver at some point. We know that because of the circulation, blood will pass through many organs, but this glucagon is only going to affect mainly two organs, like we said. One of those organs is the liver, and so when this glucagon reaches the liver, it causes the conversion of glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, into glucose. So it's just like you had some food packed in your bag. When it's lunchtime, you get that food and start eating it. It's very simple. Insulin was causing the packaging of glucose into glycogen, while glucagon causes the liver to start converting that glycogen that was stored back to glucose. And we know that if there's low glucose levels and the liver starts making some glucose from glycogen, we're going to expect that there will be increased blood glucose levels. Now, let's talk about the second organ which glucagon is able to affect. This is the adipose tissue, and we know already that glucagon will be secreted when there's low blood glucose, and it will be secreted by the alpha cells of the pancreas. It's very important to note that the adipose tissue will be working in conjunction with the liver to increase the blood glucose levels. So what happens is exactly the reverse of what happened with insulin. So if you are able to relate these two hormones working antagonistically to each other, which is just meaning opposite to each other, you can see what insulin does is what glucagon does in the opposite way. So if insulin was causing the making of fats, glucagon is going to be causing the breaking down of fats. Glucagon, once it reaches the adipose tissue, is going to cause the splitting of fats into fatty acids and glycerol. Remember, I said the adipose tissue works in conjunction with the liver. So after this breakage of these two things in two parts, what happens is that these subcomponents of fats are taken to the liver, where they will be converted obviously back to glucose. And the result of this is that we're going to have a bit of raising of this amount of glucose in our blood. One thing that is very important to understand as we're talking about these hormones of the pancreas is the negative feedback mechanism in which they work. Here we've got something that can be used to explain. When you say negative feedback mechanism, we're just referring to this mechanism making changes that are opposite to what was there actually. If they are low, these hormones are going to make the conditions get higher. Obviously, they won't make the conditions very high, but they'll just make changes that will be causing the condition to lessen. With that said and done, let's talk about diabetes mellitus in a quick manner. Diabetes mellitus is a disease in which blood glucose levels are higher than normal. And so what you understand is that this is a disease related to insulin. There are two types of diabetes mellitus, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 diabetes mellitus is slightly different from type 2. You will see how. What happens in type 1 is that the body creates a special kind of antibodies which unfortunately attack the beta cells. And now you know that if the beta cells are attacked, it means insulin production will be reduced. And you can guess what happens if insulin production is reduced. The blood glucose levels begin to rise. What you need to really get note of is that in type 1 we've got antibodies attacking the beta cells, which later causes the increase of glucose. In type 2 you're going to see that that's not the case. We are going to have the body developing insulin resistance. And when we talk about insulin resistance, it just simply means the body is going to kind of stop responding to insulin. This is usually a result of diseases caused by being excessively fat. Now, we know that if someone is insulin resistant, it means the beta cells are going to produce insulin, but the body cells that are supposed to make use of this insulin fail to do that. Obviously, we know we've got the liver, adipose tissue, and muscle cells. So these three target organs start failing to make use of this insulin because of the insulin resistant as a result of diseases caused by obesity. And now the result of this lack of use of the insulin is going to result in the increase of blood glucose levels. There are 4 symptoms that are very prone for people with diabetes mellitus. The first one is obviously what we've been talking about all along, high levels of glucose in blood. Obviously, you can't forget this one because insulin is produced when we have high levels of glucose in blood. Now, the second is that someone with diabetes mellitus has some glucose present when they urinate. Because there will be too much glucose in blood that we have found as the first symptom, some glucose will be able to penetrate through the capillaries of the Bowman's capsule. The next symptom is increased thirst for water. This is because a person suffering from diabetes mellitus will be passing out large amounts of urine, and therefore the blood levels might practically get reduced, and therefore the body needs to restore the blood volumes, and hence it must trigger this feeling of thirst. The last but not the least symptom is unexplained weight loss. This unexplained weight loss is due to the fact that the way in which this insulin is working in the body is that when insulin gets to a target organ, it causes that target organ to start accepting glucose into the cell. Now, because in diabetes sometimes there be this insulin resistance or the lack of the production of insulin, it means those target organs won't receive that signal to bring glucose into them, and therefore some body parts are going to lack glucose, and the response to that is like we have low glucose levels in blood, and so the body will be forced to start burning fats and converting those storage forms of glucose like glycogen into glucose, and therefore a person will lose weight, not because they are not eating, but because their body lacks insulin, which is making the glucose to enter those target cells and cause that glucose to be used. You have finally reached the bonus tip section. In today's video, we've got some tips for you that are very important. The first are some useful terms that you can know. These terms might look difficult right from a glance, but let me help you break them down. Whenever we have genesis, like for the first two here, we mean formation. And whenever we have glyco, we're talking about glycogen. Let's try to see that. Glycogen, and glycogenolysis, we're also talking about glycogen. It's only for glycosuria when we're talking about the presence of glucose in urine. Another thing you're going to see about these terms is these two words here. Glycemia means a state when there's something about glucose in our bodies, and so when we have hyper we have high, when we have hypo we have low. It's easy for you to link hypoglycemia to low blood sugar because of the O. Low and hypo both have O's. Now when we come to lysis, we're talking about the breaking down. Remember, we have glyco here, so glycogenolysis just means the breaking down of something related to glycogen, and of course it's glycogen. When we have LIP, lipolysis, we're talking about the breaking down of fats. How do you remember this? Lipids are just the collective name for fats and oils, and so that term is used for this scientific term to mean the breaking down of fats. In the last one, we're talking about one of the symptoms of a person with diabetes mellitus. The second tip is the treatment for diabetes mellitus. Obviously, type 1 patients will be treated different from type 2 patients. The type 1 lack insulin production, and so they will be given insulin injection. They are injected with insulin instead of given tablets, because if they're given tablets, insulin is a peptide and might be broken down by the digestive enzymes. Type 2, you can remember that one of the main reasons of this was insulin resistance, and that resistance might come because of someone having obesity, being excessively obese or being excessively fat. And therefore, a treatment for these people who have type 2 diabetes is a restricted diet and regular exercise. Obviously, that will be linked to them just reducing the amount of fat that they've had. However, in some cases, they might be given medication. The third tip is about diabetes insipidus, which is caused by the lack of ADH, but it's rarely talked about. And if you can link antidiuretic hormone to this kind of diabetes, you obviously know that a person will be failing to reabsorb water, because ADH is a very important hormone secreted by the pituitary gland that enables the kidneys to reabsorb water. Thanks for watching this video till the end. Make sure you watch out other videos which will be about more endocrine glands.